The crack of a revolver shot echoed through the dusty streets of Challis, Idaho Territory. But it wasn't the gunfire that made Rebecca Zimmerman flinch. It was the jeers that followed her as she limped down the wooden sidewalk, medical bag clutched tightly against her chest, trying to ignore the taunts that had become as familiar as the pain in her twisted left leg. "Here comes Limping Becky. Better not get sick, folks, she might trip and fall before she reaches your bedside," called Jasper Tully from outside the saloon, earning cruel laughter from the loafers gathered around him. Rebecca kept her eyes forward, her jaw set. 3 months in Challis, and the mockery hadn't subsided one bit. If anything, it had grown worse. The town had been desperate enough for a nurse to hire her when influenza swept through last winter, but not kind enough to accept her once they discovered her disability. "Ignore them," she whispered to herself, adjusting the weight of her medical bag. She was 24 years old, a trained nurse from back east, and had survived far worse than small-town ridicule. The polio that had struck her as a child had left her with a permanently weakened leg, but it had also forged her determination. Still, some days were harder than others. As she approached the general store, Mrs. Miller stepped outside with her young son. The woman's eyes widened slightly at the sight of Rebecca, then she promptly steered her child to the opposite side of the street. Rebecca felt the sting of rejection but kept her face neutral. She had patience to see people who needed her skills even if they mocked her afterward. "Miss Zimmerman," a small voice called out. Rebecca turned to see little Emma Peterson waving enthusiastically from her father's wagon. The girl's mother had died during childbirth 2 months prior, and Rebecca had been helping care for the infant that had survived. Emma, at 8 years old, was one of the few souls in town who seemed genuinely happy to see her. "Hello, Emma," Rebecca called back with a smile. Her gaze then lifted to meet the eyes of the girl's father, and her heart quickened its pace as it always did in his presence. Ross Peterson tipped his hat politely. Unlike most men in Challis, he never joined in the mockery. A widower and cattle rancher with 3 children, he had always treated Rebecca with respect. At 32, Ross had the weathered face of a man who worked outdoors, with kind blue eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. And he was smiling now as he helped his daughter down from the wagon. "Miss Zimmerman," he greeted, his voice low and warm. "How is your day going?" Before Rebecca could answer, Jasper's voice called out, "Hey, Peterson, better watch your kids around that one. She might drop your baby with that bad leg of hers." Rebecca's face burned with humiliation. She started to turn away when Ross's voice cut through the air, sharp as a knife. "That's enough, Tully," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Miss Zimmerman has more medical knowledge in her little finger than you've got sense in your whole body. Show some respect." Jasper mumbled something inaudible and slunk back into the saloon. Rebecca looked up at Ross, surprised by his defense. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson, but you needn't bother. I'm quite used to it." "That doesn't make it right," Ross replied, his jaw tight. "Are you headed to see Mrs. Jenkins? I heard her time is near." Rebecca nodded. "Yes, I should reach her place by noon if I keep a steady pace." Ross frowned, glancing at her leg and then at the heavy medical bag. "That's 5 miles outside town and the sun's already high. Let me drive you." "I couldn't impose. It's no imposition," he insisted. "I need to check fencing on that side of my property anyway. Emma and I just finished our errands in town. The boys are with my foreman today." He nodded toward his wagon. "Please." Rebecca hesitated, but the prospect of avoiding the long, painful walk was too tempting to refuse. "If you're certain it's not out of your way." "Not at all," he said, offering his arm to help her up to the wagon seat. The simple gesture of support, offered without pity or disgust, nearly brought tears to her eyes. As they drove out of town, Emma chattering happily between them, Rebecca caught herself stealing glances at Ross's strong profile. She quickly admonished herself for such thoughts. A man like Ross Peterson, respected, handsome, hardworking, would never look twice at the limping nurse, regardless of how kindly he treated her. But as the wagon jostled over a particularly rough section of road, Ross reached out a steady hand to keep her from losing her balance. "I've got you," he said quietly, and for the first time in months, Rebecca felt something other than pain and isolation. She felt hope. The Peterson Ranch sprawled across 400 acres of prime Idaho grazing land. Ross had built it from nearly nothing after coming west with his first wife, Maria, 10 years earlier. The main house was modest but well constructed, with a wide porch and sturdy log walls. Several outbuildings dotted the property, including a bunkhouse for the 2 ranch hands he employed. After delivering Rebecca to Mrs. Jenkins' cabin, where she helped the woman through a difficult but ultimately successful labor, Ross returned as promised to bring her back to town. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the trail as they rode, Emma now dozing between them, tired from the day's activities. "She likes you," Ross observed, nodding toward his sleeping daughter. Rebecca smiled softly. "She's a sweet child. All your children are." "They miss their mother," he said simply. "Michael barely remembers her, but Emma and James, it's been harder for them, especially since the baby." Rebecca nodded. Ross's wife had died giving birth to their 4th child, a boy they'd named Thomas. The baby was thriving now, but Rebecca knew Ross struggled to manage his grief while raising 4 children and running a cattle operation. "How is Thomas doing with the new milk formula I suggested?" she asked. "Much better. He's finally putting on weight." Ross glanced at her, appreciation evident in his eyes. "You've been a godsend, Miss Zimmerman. I don't know what we would have done without your help." Rebecca felt her cheeks warm. "I'm simply doing my job, Mr. Peterson." "Ross," he corrected gently. "After all you've done for my family, I think we can dispense with formalities." "Then you must call me Rebecca," she replied, surprising herself with her boldness. He smiled, and the simple expression transformed his face. "Rebecca it is." They fell into comfortable conversation as the wagon rumbled toward town. Ross told her about his plans for the ranch, his hopes to expand his herd, and his struggles with balancing work and fatherhood. Rebecca found herself opening up as well, sharing stories of her training in Philadelphia and her decision to come west after her parents' death left her with no family ties. "Why Challies?" Ross asked. "It's hardly the most welcoming place for a woman on her own." Rebecca sighed. "The advertisement said they were desperate for medical help. I thought perhaps in a place where need outweighed prejudice, my leg wouldn't matter so much." She gave a rueful laugh. "I was naive." Ross's hands tightened on the reins. "It shouldn't matter. Your skill is what counts, not how you walk." "The world rarely operates as it should," she replied softly, "but I've made my peace with it." "Have you?" His question was gentle but probing. Before she could answer, they crested a hill, and the town of Challies came into view, its buildings bathed in the golden light of sunset. Rebecca felt a familiar knot form in her stomach at the thought of returning to her small room above the mercantile, to the whispers and stares she would face tomorrow. As if reading her thoughts, Ross said, "You know, Rebecca, I've been thinking. With Thomas growing and the other children needing more attention, I could use help at the ranch. A live-in nurse and teacher for the children." Rebecca turned to him, startled. "Are you offering me a position?" "I am," he confirmed. "Room and board plus wages. The children already adore you, and it would be a relief to have someone with medical knowledge close by." Ranch accidents happen all too frequently. The proposal was tempting, almost too tempting. Away from town, away from the daily humiliation, and close to Ross and his children, whom she'd grown fond of over the past months. "It's a generous offer," she said carefully, "but I have obligations to the town. The council hired me to serve all the residents. The same residents who mock you daily." Ross's voice was tight with anger. "You deserve better, Rebecca." "Perhaps," she acknowledged, "but I need to think about it." He nodded, respecting her need for consideration. "The offer stands whenever you're ready." As they approached the edge of town, Rebecca spotted a group of men outside the saloon, Jasper Tully among them. She tensed involuntarily, and Ross noticed. "Let me help you to your door," he offered. "That will only give them more to talk about," Rebecca protested. "Let them talk," Ross said firmly. "I'm not afraid of gossip." But Rebecca knew better. In small towns like Challies, gossip could destroy reputations, and Ross had his children to consider. "Thank you, but I'll be fine from here. The Mercantile is just down the street." Reluctantly, Ross stopped the wagon near the town square. "At least let me help you down." Rebecca agreed to this small compromise. As Ross's strong hands encircled her waist to lift her from the wagon, their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between them. For a moment, neither moved, his hands still at her waist, her palms resting lightly on his shoulders. Emma stirred, breaking the spell. Rebecca stepped back, smoothing her skirts nervously. "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Ross, and for your offer. I will consider it carefully." He handed her the medical bag. "Don't wait too long. The children are asking for you already." As Rebecca limped toward her lodgings, she felt Jasper and his friends watching. But for once, their stares didn't cut quite as deeply. The memory of Ross's hands at her waist, the kindness in his eyes, served as a shield against their cruelty. That night, as she prepared for bed, Rebecca found herself considering Ross's offer more seriously than she had initially intended. The thought of living at the Peterson ranch, helping with the children, being valued for her skills rather than mocked for her disability, was powerfully appealing. Yet she hesitated, wondering if accepting would mean surrendering to the town's prejudice. A sharp knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, Rebecca answered to find Sheriff Daniels standing there, his expression grave. "Miss Zimmerman, sorry to disturb you so late, but there's been an accident at the Peterson place. One of the hands came for you, said the youngest boy fell ill suddenly with a high fever and is having trouble breathing." Rebecca's heart lurched. "Thomas, I'll come right away." Moving with practiced efficiency despite her leg, Rebecca gathered her medical supplies. Within minutes, she was mounted behind one of Ross's ranch hands on a sturdy horse, heading back toward the Peterson ranch at a gallop, fear for the infant driving all other concerns from her mind. The ride was punishing on her bad leg, but Rebecca barely noticed the pain. By the time they reached the ranch, her medical mind was fully engaged, mentally reviewing possible causes and treatments for an infant's sudden fever and respiratory distress. Ross met her at the door, his face haggard with worry. "Thank God you're here," he said, leading her quickly to a small bedroom where Thomas lay in a cradle, his tiny face flushed with fever, his breathing labored and wheezing. Rebecca set to work immediately, examining the baby with gentle, practiced hands. "How long has he been like this?" "He seemed fussy at dinner, but I thought he was just tired," Ross explained, his voice tight with guilt. "By bedtime, he was burning up." "The breathing problem started about an hour ago." Rebecca listened to the baby's chest with her stethoscope, noting the congestion in his lungs. After a thorough examination, she looked up at Ross. "It's croup. Severe, but treatable if we act quickly." She instructed Ross to boil water to create steam in the room and prepared a solution of herbs from her medical bag. "We need to ease his breathing and break the fever," she explained, her calm professionalism masking her own concern. Throughout the night, Rebecca worked tirelessly to treat the infant, applying cool compresses when the fever spiked, administering herbal remedies, and monitoring his breathing constantly. Ross never left the room, helping where he could, watching with anxious eyes as she fought to save his son. Near dawn, Thomas's fever finally broke and his breathing eased. The worst had passed. Rebecca sat back in the chair beside the cradle, exhaustion washing over her. "You should rest," Ross said softly, touching her shoulder. "You've been up all night." Rebecca shook her head. "I want to monitor him a bit longer to be sure." Ross pulled another chair close to hers and sat down. "Then I'll wait with you." They sat in companionable silence, watching the now peaceful baby. Ross's hand found hers in the dim light, his fingers wrapping around hers in a gesture of gratitude and something more. "You saved him," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." "It's what I'm trained to do," Rebecca replied, though she couldn't bring herself to withdraw her hand from his. "It's more than that," Ross insisted. "It's who you are, skilled, yes, but also compassionate, determined, strong." He squeezed her hand gently. "The people in town who mock you are fools who can't see past their own narrow minds." Rebecca felt tears threaten and blinked them away. "It's kind of you to say so. It's the truth." Ross's gaze was intense, searching her face in the soft light of dawn filtering through the window. "Stay, Rebecca. Not just as a nurse or a teacher, but because we need you here. The children need you." He faltered, then continued more quietly, "I need you." The weight of his words hung between them, full of unspoken meaning. Before Rebecca could respond, Emma appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Is Thomas better?" she asked anxiously. Ross beckoned his daughter over. "Yes, sweetheart. Miss Zimmerman made him well again." Emma threw her arms around Rebecca's neck. "Thank you for fixing Thomas," she said, then added hopefully, "Are you staying for breakfast?" Rebecca looked from Emma's eager face to Ross's expectant one. "Yes," she said at last. "I think I will." The days that followed took on a new rhythm. Rebecca returned to town to gather her few belongings and inform the town council of her decision to accept a position at the Peterson ranch. The council members were displeased but reluctantly acknowledged they had no binding contract with her. Some expressed relief that the cripple would no longer be representing their town to visitors. Sheriff Daniels, one of the few who had always treated Rebecca with respect, helped her transport her trunk to the Peterson ranch. "You'll be missed by some of us," he told her as they arrived. "But I can't say I blame you for leaving." Life at the ranch was busy but fulfilling. Rebecca established a sick room in one of the spare bedrooms, organized lessons for Emma and 6-year-old James, and provided daily care for Thomas, who recovered completely from his bout with croup. 10-year-old Michael was initially standoffish, viewing Rebecca as an intruder in his family, but gradually warmed to her when she showed interest in his love of horses and never babied him as some adults did. Ross was a constant presence, working from dawn until dusk with his cattle and ranch chores, but always finding time to check in with Rebecca and the children. She noticed how he made special efforts to include her, asking her opinion on matters beyond medicine and education, seeking her company in the evenings when the children were asleep. One evening in late June, about a month after Rebecca had come to live at the ranch, Ross found her sitting on the porch swing, enjoying the cool breeze after a hot day. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his hat in his hands. "Please do," she replied, shifting to make room. He sat beside her, the swing creaking slightly under his weight. For a few minutes they rocked in silence, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. "The children seem happier," Ross observed finally. "Especially Emma. She's blooming under your teaching." Rebecca smiled. "She's a bright girl. They're all wonderful children. They think the world of you," Ross said. "Michael asked me yesterday if you were going to stay forever." Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. "What did you tell him?" "That I hoped so." Ross turned to face her, his expression serious. "I meant it, Rebecca. These weeks with you here, the ranch hasn't felt this much like a home since Maria died." Rebecca looked down at her hands. "I've been happy here too, happier than I've been in a long time." "But," Ross prompted, sensing her hesitation. "But I worry about what this arrangement looks like to others," she admitted. "A single woman living in the home of a widower." "Is that why you've been keeping such a careful distance?" Ross asked. "Because of gossip," Rebecca nodded. "Your reputation matters, Ross, for the children's sake if nothing else." Ross ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "My reputation is my own concern, and if people want to talk, they'll find reason to regardless of what we do." "Still," Rebecca insisted, "I need to be careful. For all our sakes." Ross was quiet for a long moment, then asked softly, "And if there were no need for distance? If there were a reason for you to be here that no one could question?" Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying, Ross?" He took her hand in his calloused palm warm against her skin. "I'm not a man who believes in wasting time, Rebecca. Life out here is too uncertain for that. I've watched you with my children, seen your strength and kindness, your intelligence and determination. I admire you more than any woman I've ever known." "Ross," Rebecca began, overwhelmed by his words. "Let me finish," he said gently. "I know it's soon. Too soon, perhaps, but I find myself thinking of you as more than the children's nurse or teacher. Much more." "You can't mean—" "I do," he said firmly. "I'm falling in love with you, Rebecca Zimmerman. And if you could see your way to considering a future with us as a family, I would be the most fortunate man in Idaho Territory." Rebecca stared at him, scarcely able to believe what she was hearing. "You can't love me," she whispered. "My leg has nothing to do with who you are," Ross interrupted, a flash of anger in his eyes. "Do you think so little of me that you believe I would care about such a thing?" "No, but nothing," he said firmly. "When I look at you, I don't see a woman with a limp. I see a woman of extraordinary courage and compassion. A woman who's traveled halfway across the country alone, who faces mockery with dignity, who saved my son's life." His voice softened. "A woman I want to build a life with if she'll have me." Tears filled Rebecca's eyes. No man had ever looked past her disability before, had ever seen her as simply a woman worthy of love and respect. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to answer now," Ross assured her. "Take all the time you need to think about it. But know that my feelings won't change." Before Rebecca could respond, the sound of approaching hooves interrupted them. Ross stood, instantly alert, his hand moving to the revolver he wore at his hip. In the fading light, they could make out a single rider approaching at a gallop. "Stay here," Ross told Rebecca, moving to the edge of the porch as the rider drew nearer. The rider reined in hard in front of the house, and Rebecca recognized Mark Wilson, one of the miners from the settlement north of Challies. "Peterson," Wilson called, not bothering to dismount. "There's a fire at the mine camp. Several men are trapped and there's injured everywhere. We need the nurse." Ross turned to Rebecca, who was already on her feet. "I'll come," she said without hesitation, her medical instincts overriding all other concerns. "I'll get the wagon," Ross decided. "You gather what supplies you'll need." Within 15 minutes, they were heading north at the fastest pace the horses could maintain, Rebecca's medical bags packed with everything she might need for burn treatment and trauma care. Ross had left the children in the care of his foreman's wife, promising to return as soon as possible. The mining camp was chaos when they arrived, with smoke still rising from the collapsed entrance to the main shaft. Men were working frantically to clear debris while others tended to the injured who had managed to escape before the cave-in. Rebecca didn't hesitate, directing Ross to set up a treatment area in the largest tent available. She organized the miners' wives to boil water and tear sheets into bandages, then began triaging the injured, moving from man to man with calm efficiency despite the pain in her leg from the long, bumpy ride. She worked through the night, treating burns, setting broken bones, stitching wounds, and comforting the dying. Ross stayed by her side, assisting where he could, bringing her water and supporting her when her leg threatened to give out beneath her. "You need to rest," he urged after she'd been working for hours without a break. "I can't," she replied, washing blood from her hands before moving to the next patient. "There are too many who need help." By dawn, they had extracted all the survivors from the mine, bringing the total casualty count to 8 dead and 15 injured of varying severity. Rebecca had stabilized the worst cases and instructed the women on ongoing care for the others. As the sun rose, casting long shadows across the devastated camp, Rebecca finally allowed Ross to lead her to a quiet spot away from the makeshift hospital. "You're astonishing," he said, handing her a cup of coffee. "I've never seen anyone work like that." Rebecca took the coffee gratefully, her hands trembling with exhaustion. "I only wish I could have done more for those who died." "You did everything humanly possible," Ross assured her, "more than anyone could have expected." Rebecca looked up at him, struck by the admiration in his eyes. "Thank you for being here. I couldn't have managed alone." "You would have found a way," he said with conviction, "but I'm glad I could help." They were interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Daniels, who had ridden up from Challies upon hearing of the disaster. With him was Dr. Franklin from Salmon City, the nearest town with a physician. "Miss Zimmerman," the sheriff said, tipping his hat, "word of your work here has already spread. The whole territory will be talking about it by sundown." Dr. Franklin examined Rebecca's patients and was visibly impressed by her treatment. "Excellent work, nurse," he said grudgingly. "These men are fortunate you were nearby." Once the doctor had taken charge, Sheriff Daniels approached Rebecca and Ross again. "You both look dead on your feet. Head on home. There's nothing more you can do here." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them too exhausted for conversation. Rebecca found herself drifting in and out of consciousness, leaning against Ross's solid shoulder as the wagon rumbled south toward Challies. "Rebecca," Ross said softly, waking her from a doze. "Look." She blinked, disoriented, then realized they had stopped at the northern edge of Challies. People were gathered on the main street, and as Ross drove the wagon forward, a surprising thing happened. They began to applaud. Word of Rebecca's heroic work at the mine had indeed traveled fast. The miners' families had spread the tale of the limping nurse who had worked through the night, saving lives that would have been lost without her skill and dedication. As they passed through town, even Jasper Tully stood with hat in hand, a chastened expression on his face. Mrs. Miller, who had once crossed the street to avoid Rebecca, stepped forward to place a bouquet of wildflowers in the wagon. "Thank you," she said simply. "My brother was among those you saved." Overwhelmed, Rebecca could only nod in acknowledgement as Ross drove on, his hand covering hers in quiet support. "It seems Challies has reconsidered its opinion of you," he observed as they left the town behind. "Perhaps," Rebecca said, still stunned by the reception. "Though I wonder how long their gratitude will last. Long enough, I hope, for them to see what I've seen all along, that your leg has nothing to do with your worth." Rebecca turned to him, studying his profile in the afternoon light. "You've always seen me clearly, haven't you? From the very beginning." Ross met her gaze, his eyes warm. "I like to think so." They reached the ranch to find the children waiting anxiously on the porch. Emma ran to the wagon as Ross helped Rebecca down, her young face pinched with worry. "Are you all right?" she demanded, taking Rebecca's hand. "Mrs. Donovan said there was a terrible accident and you were helping the hurt men." Rebecca squeezed the girl's hand reassuringly. "I'm fine, Emma, just very tired." "Then you need to rest," Emma decided, tugging her toward the house with all the authority of a miniature nurse. "I'll bring you tea in bed. That's what you always do for us when we're tired." Rebecca glanced back at Ross, who was watching the exchange with a tender smile. "I think I'm being well taken care of," she told him. "Indeed," he agreed. "Emma is becoming quite the caretaker. She learns from the best." Emma insisted on escorting Rebecca to her room, fussing over her like a mother hen, bringing her tea and toast despite Mrs. Donovan's offers to help. The other children came to check on her as well, even Michael, who awkwardly presented her with a carved wooden horse he'd been working on. "It's not very good," he mumbled, "but I thought you might like it." Rebecca accepted the gift with genuine delight. "It's beautiful, Michael, thank you." Later, after she had rested and bathed, Rebecca found Ross alone on the porch, watching the sunset just as they had been doing when news of the mine disaster arrived. "The children are all asleep," she told him, taking a seat beside him on the swing. "Even Thomas went down without a fuss." "They were worried about you," Ross said. "We all were. You pushed yourself too hard at the mine." Rebecca shrugged. "It needed to be done." "Yes, but at what cost? Your leg is paining you more than usual. I can tell by the way you're moving." She couldn't deny it. "It will ease with rest." Ross studied her for a long moment, then said quietly, "I meant what I said before we were interrupted yesterday, about my feelings for you." Rebecca's heart quickened. "I know you did. And have you had time to consider your answer?" She had thought of little else, even amidst the chaos at the mine. "Ross, are you certain? A woman with my limitations—" "What limitations?" he interrupted. "I watched you work for 12 hours straight, saving lives in conditions that would have broken most people." "Your leg doesn't limit you, Rebecca. If anything, it's made you stronger. Not everyone sees it that way." "I don't care how others see it," Ross said firmly. "I care how I see it, how the children see it." He took her hand. "Emma asked me this morning if you could be her new mother. She said you make the house feel like a home again." Tears stung Rebecca's eyes. "She did," Ross nodded. "Even Michael, as reserved as he is, said that he likes having you here, that you don't treat him like a baby like some of the women in town do." "I love your children," Rebecca admitted. "All of them, more than I thought possible." "And their father?" Ross asked softly. Rebecca met his gaze, allowing herself to acknowledge what she had been feeling for weeks. "Their father most of all." Ross's face lit with joy. He leaned forward, his hand gently cupping her cheek, and kissed her. It was a tender kiss, full of promise and respect, and Rebecca found herself responding with an emotion she had never expected to feel: desire. When they parted, Ross kept his forehead pressed to hers. "Marry me, Rebecca," he whispered. "Be my wife, a mother to my children. Let me love you as you deserve to be loved." Rebecca closed her eyes, savoring the moment. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you." Their wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small church in Challies. To Rebecca's surprise, the church was full. Not just with Ross's friends and the few people who had always been kind to her, but with miners and their families from the camp, with townspeople who had once mocked her limp, but now looked at her with newfound respect. Emma served as her bridesmaid, proudly holding Rebecca's bouquet of wildflowers during the ceremony. Michael and James stood tall beside their father, trying their best to look solemn though excitement shone in their eyes. Mrs. Donovan held baby Thomas, who gurgled happily throughout the proceedings. As Rebecca walked down the aisle, she was acutely conscious of her uneven gait. But for the first time, she felt no shame in it. Ross watched her approach with such love in his eyes that nothing else mattered, not the whispers of the past, not the physical pain that would always be her companion. "You are beautiful," he told her as she reached his side. "I love you," she whispered back. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ross surprised everyone by sweeping Rebecca into his arms before kissing her, holding her aloft as if she weighed nothing at all. The celebration afterward was lively, with music and dancing spilling out from the church hall onto the streets of Challis. Rebecca sat watching the festivities, her leg too tired for dancing after the excitement of the day, when Jasper Tully approached her table. "Mrs. Peterson," he said, hat in hand, his usual bravado absent. "I owe you an apology. The things I said, they were cruel and wrong." Rebecca studied him, seeing the genuine remorse in his face. "Thank you, Mr. Tully. Apology accepted." "My cousin was one of the men you saved at the mine," he continued. "Doc Franklin said he would have died without your quick action." He shuffled his feet awkwardly. "Just wanted you to know that Challis is lucky to have you, bad leg or not." Before Rebecca could respond, Ross appeared at her side. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his protective instinct evident. "Just fine," Rebecca assured him, reaching for his hand. "Mr. Tully was being kind enough to congratulate us." Jasper nodded quickly. "You got yourself a fine wife, Peterson, a real fine wife." He tipped his hat and retreated to the punch bowl. Ross watched him go with raised eyebrows. "That's a change of tune. People can surprise you," Rebecca said with a small smile. "Sometimes for the better." As the evening wore on, Rebecca found herself growing tired. Ross noticed immediately. "Ready to head home?" he asked. She nodded gratefully. "If you don't mind, it's been a long day." "The children are staying with the Donovans tonight," Ross reminded her with a meaningful look that made her blush. "We'll have the house to ourselves." They said their goodbyes, accepting congratulations and well wishes from the guests. As they stepped outside, Rebecca realized she had left her shawl inside. "I'll just be a moment," she told Ross. When she returned, she found him waiting with the wagon, but he made no move to help her up. Instead, he approached her with a tender smile. "Your leg is paining you," he said. "It wasn't a question." "A little," she admitted. "It's been a busy day." Without warning, Ross bent and swept her into his arms, cradling her against his chest. "Ross, what are you doing?" She gasped, instinctively wrapping her arms around his neck for balance. "Carrying my wife," he replied simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "People will see, let them," he said, carrying her toward the wagon. "Let them see how a husband treats the woman he loves." Rebecca relaxed against him, allowing herself to enjoy the novel sensation of being carried so effortlessly. As Ross settled her in the wagon and climbed up beside her, she noticed several townspeople watching, their expressions varying from surprise to approval. "I told you once," Ross said as he took up the reins, "and I'll tell you again now. I'll carry you when you're tired, Rebecca. Not because you're weak or because I pity you, but because I love you, and that's what husbands do for their wives." Rebecca leaned into his side, happiness washing through her. "Take me home, Ross." The years that followed brought changes both expected and surprising to the Peterson ranch. Rebecca continued to provide medical care to the people of Challis and the surrounding area. But now she did so with the full support and respect of the community. The town council, recognizing the value of her services, eventually offered her a formal position as the town's medical practitioner, which she accepted on the condition that she could maintain her home at the ranch and divide her time between town and family. Ross's cattle business flourished with Rebecca's practical assistance in keeping the books and managing household affairs, allowing him to focus more on the ranching operations. They expanded the main house, adding rooms for their growing family. For 9 months after their wedding, Rebecca gave birth to a son they named Robert, followed 2 years later by a daughter, Sarah. The children from Ross's first marriage embraced Rebecca fully as their mother. Emma followed in her stepmother's footsteps, showing an interest in medicine and healing that Rebecca enthusiastically encouraged. Michael grew into a fine young man who worked alongside his father on the ranch, his initial standoffishness long forgotten. James discovered a talent for training horses that brought additional income and recognition to the Peterson name, while little Thomas, healthy and strong, showed signs of becoming the scholar of the family. Rebecca's leg continued to trouble her, especially during harsh Idaho winters or after particularly long days of work, but she no longer felt defined by her disability. Ross was true to his word on days when pain made walking difficult. He would simply lift her in his strong arms and carry her where she needed to go, whether it was up the stairs to bed or from the house to the garden she had planted in their 2nd year of marriage. 5 years after their wedding, Rebecca was examining a patient in her clinic in town when Sheriff Daniels burst through the door. "Mrs. Peterson, there's been a bad accident at the sawmill. 2 men pinned under logs. We need you right away." Rebecca gathered her medical bag and hurried out to the sheriff's waiting wagon. As they raced toward the sawmill at the edge of town, she spotted Ross riding in from the ranch on his favorite stallion. Seeing the sheriff's wagon, Ross changed direction to intercept them. "What's happened?" he called. "Sawmill accident," Rebecca replied as the sheriff reined in briefly. "Bad injuries, they say." Without hesitation, Ross swung his horse alongside the wagon. "I'll come with you." At the sawmill, they found a scene of chaos. 2 men lay trapped beneath a massive pine log that had slipped from its moorings. Workers were attempting to lever it off them with poles, but making little progress. Ross immediately took charge, organizing the men into teams and directing the use of the mill's own equipment to safely raise the log. Once the injured men were freed, Rebecca moved in to assess their conditions. One had suffered only a broken leg and minor cuts, but the other, Sam Fletcher, had massive internal injuries. Rebecca worked frantically to stabilize him, her hands steady despite the gravity of his wounds. "Rebecca," Ross said quietly, kneeling beside her after she had been working for nearly an hour. "He's going." She knew it was true. Fletcher's pulse was thready beneath her fingers, his breathing shallow. She had done all she could with the limited tools and medicines available to her. "His wife," she whispered. "Someone should fetch her." "Already sent for," Ross assured her, his hand warm on her shoulder. Fletcher's wife arrived just in time to say goodbye to her husband. As life slipped away from the injured man, Rebecca felt the familiar weight of failure that came with losing a patient. She stepped back, allowing the widow her privacy and grief, and found herself leaning heavily on her bad leg, which had cramped painfully during her long vigil beside Fletcher. Ross noticed immediately. Without a word, he lifted her into his arms, carrying her away from the scene to a quiet spot beside the mill pond. "You did everything you could," he told her, setting her gently on a fallen log. "It wasn't enough," she replied, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling over. "It never feels like enough when we lose someone," Ross agreed, sitting beside her and pulling her close. "But think of how many you've saved over the years." including me and the children, in more ways than one. Rebecca rested her head on his shoulder, drawing strength from his solid presence. When did you become so wise, Ross Peterson? I married a wise woman, he replied with a small smile. Some of it was bound to rub off eventually. They sat together as the sun set, casting golden light across the mill pond, until Rebecca's leg had recovered enough for her to stand. "Ready to go home?" Ross asked. "Yes," she said, taking his offered arm. "The children will be waiting." As they walked toward their horses, Rebecca moving with her characteristic uneven gait, they passed a group of townspeople who had gathered after hearing of the accident. Among them was Jasper Tully, now the owner of Challies' largest saloon and a reformed character since his own brush with death 3 years earlier. "Evening, Mrs. Peterson," he called respectfully. "Everyone's saying if not for your quick work, we'd have lost both men today instead of just poor Fletcher." Rebecca acknowledged him with a nod, too emotionally drained for conversation. "Your wife needs rest, Tully," Ross said firmly. "Any praise can wait for another day." Course, Jasper agreed hastily. "Just wanted her to know folks appreciate what she does for this town, limping or not." As they continued toward their horses, Rebecca couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. The same people who had once mocked her disability now spoke of it as an afterthought, if they mentioned it at all. What mattered to them now was her skill, her dedication, her willingness to help regardless of personal cost. "What are you thinking about?" Ross asked as he helped her mount. "Just how different things are now," she replied. "How different I feel." Ross swung up onto his own horse. "Different how?" Rebecca considered the question as they rode side by side toward home. "When I first came to Challies, I felt so, defined by my leg. As if it was all anyone could see when they looked at me, all I could see when I looked at myself. And now," Ross prompted. "Now I feel defined by so many other things," she said with a smile. "By being your wife, the children's mother, by the work I do and the life we've built together." She reached across to touch his arm. "You gave me that, Ross. You and the children." "We gave it to each other," he corrected gently. "That day when I offered to carry you when you were tired, I meant it literally, but it became something more, didn't it? A promise that we would support each other through whatever life brought our way." "And we have," Rebecca agreed, thinking of all they had weathered together, drought years that threatened the ranch, illnesses that had swept through the family, the joy of new births and the sorrow of saying goodbye to Ross's mother 2 winters ago. They crested the final hill before the ranch came into view, the windows of the main house glowing with lamplight in the gathering dusk. On the porch, they could make out the figures of their children, waiting eagerly for their return. "Look at them," Ross said with pride. "All 6 of our children, healthy and strong." Rebecca felt her heart swell with love. "We've been blessed." As they rode into the yard, the children swarmed around them, all talking at once. Emma, now 14 and nearly as tall as Rebecca, helped her stepmother dismount while Michael took charge of the horses. 10-year-old Thomas proudly announced that he had helped 8-year-old Robert with his reading, while James reported that 4-year-old Sarah had spent the afternoon helping Mrs. Donovan bake bread. "And did you save anyone today, Mama?" Sarah asked, her small face serious as Ross lifted her into his arms. Rebecca smoothed her daughter's dark curls. "We tried our very best, sweetheart." "That's all anyone can do," Emma said with the wisdom of her years, linking her arm through Rebecca's as they walked toward the house. "That's what you always tell us, isn't it, Mama?" "Indeed it is," Rebecca agreed, leaning slightly on her stepdaughter as her tired leg protested the day's exertions. Inside, the house was warm and fragrant with the smell of the stew Mrs. Donovan had prepared before departing for her own home. The children set the table while Ross and Rebecca washed up, moving around each other with the comfortable familiarity of long married couples. "You're limping more than usual," Ross observed quietly as they stood side by side at the wash basin. "It's been a long day," Rebecca admitted. Without another word, Ross swept her into his arms, carrying her to the dining room where the children were waiting. Instead of the embarrassment such an action might once have caused her, Rebecca felt only gratitude and love. "Papa's carrying Mama again," Sarah announced with delight, as if it were a special treat rather than a practical necessity. "That's what Papas do," Robert informed his little sister solemnly. "They carry Mamas when they're tired." Ross set Rebecca gently in her chair at the head of the table, bending to kiss her forehead before taking his own seat. "Out of the mouths of babes," he murmured with a wink. As Rebecca looked around the table at the faces of her family, some born of her body, others born of her heart, but all equally beloved, she felt a contentment that her younger self could never have imagined. Her life had not followed the path she had once envisioned, but it had led her to a place of such profound happiness that the difficulties along the way seemed a small price to pay. Later that night, with the children all asleep and the ranch quiet around them, Rebecca and Ross sat on the porch swing just as they had on that fateful evening when he had first declared his feelings for her. The years had added a few lines to his face, a touch of silver at his temples, but to Rebecca he was more handsome than ever. "I have something for you," Ross said, reaching into his pocket. "I've been saving it for the right moment." He placed a small wooden box in her hands. Inside, Rebecca found a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. "Open it," Ross urged. Inside were two tiny portraits, one of Ross, the other a composite of all 6 children, somehow captured in miniature. "Oh, Ross," Rebecca breathed. "It's beautiful, but what's the occasion?" "7 years ago today," he said, "I first offered to drive you to the Jenkins place because your leg was paining you. I didn't know it then, but that was the day I began falling in love with you." Rebecca's eyes widened in surprise. "You remembered the exact day?" "I remember everything about the beginning of us," he said simply. "How could I forget the day that changed my life?" As Ross fastened the locket around her neck, Rebecca thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a limping nurse mocked by a cruel town to a respected healer, beloved wife, and mother of 6. The physical pain of her disability remained, a constant companion she would carry to her grave, but it had long since ceased to be the defining fact of her existence. "I love you, Ross Peterson," she said, leaning into his embrace. "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did." "I love you too, Rebecca Peterson," he replied, his arms strong around her. "And I always will, through whatever life brings our way." As they rocked gently in the moonlight, the vast Idaho sky stretching endlessly above them, Rebecca felt a peace that transcended physical comfort or social acceptance. She had found her place in the world not despite her differences, but with them fully integrated into the fabric of a life rich with purpose and love. And when the night grew chilly and her leg began to ache, Ross carried her inside to their bedroom just as he had promised he always would, not as a burden, but as his most precious treasure.